Okay, last time I spent a lot of time on the Asch impression formation paradigm, and I did that for a couple of reasons. First, that's where the study of social cognition begins, historically. Second, that's where the study of social cognition begins conceptually, with perception. And third, the methods that Asch used in the impression formation experiment have been enormously influential, and you'll see variations on the basic impression formation paradigm over and over and over again as you do your own independent reading in this area. And just as a reminder, Asch got a number of different interesting effects, but the two that we're going to focus on here, the big two for Asch, was first that there was an order effect in impression formation. The first information that we receive about a person is inordinately influential in forming the final impression that we have about that person. And Asch argued, as a good Gestalt psychologist would, that somehow the first thing you learn about an individual creates a kind of filter that shapes and modulates everything else that you learn. Now, somebody, I can't remember who it was, raised a very interesting question last time about whether this was just a memory effect, whether the order effect in impression formation was somehow a product of the so-called primacy effect in memory. Those of you who've had a course in memory or probably introductory psychology know that in memory there are these two big effects: primacy effect, where the first information that the person studies tends to be remembered better than information in the middle of the list, and a recency effect, where the material from the end of a list tends to be remembered better than the information from the middle of the list. And it's possible that the order effect that Asch got was just a primacy effect. You got more time to rehearse it or whatever, but I don't think so. And Asch certainly wouldn't have thought so, but I don't think so either. And the reason I don't think so is that Asch's lists were really short. You notice that his trait ensembles consisted only of 6 or 7 items, and that's well within the span of short-term or working memory for most people. And these primacy and recency effects, especially the primacy effect, seems to reflect the operation of long-term memory. So Asch would have thought that this was really a perceptual effect, not a memory effect, though I think, you could still do some research on this. The second finding, the one I want to focus on today, was the finding that some traits were central to an impression and others were more peripheral. By this, Asch meant that there are some traits like warm, cold, intelligent, unintelligent that made an enormous difference to the person's final impression, to the perceiver's final impression of a person, depending on whether they were present or not. And there were other traits like polite, blunt, that just didn't make that much difference. So there are some traits that are central to impression formation and others that are more peripheral. What I want to focus on today is the question of what makes a trait central. Asch didn't know. He raised this question, but he didn't have a clear idea himself about what it was about warm versus cold or intelligent versus unintelligent, as opposed to polite versus blunt, that made traits central. And he didn't take the time, probably a good thing, because it's a lifetime's worth of work, to go through every imaginable trait polarity in the lexicon and try to figure out which ones really affected the final impressions more than the other. He just noted, as a kind of serendipitous empirical finding, he didn't think this was going to happen, that some traits were more important, had a greater impact on impressions than other traits did. The first guy to address this is actually a close friend of Asch's named Julius Wishner, who did a very interesting experiment. Again, you see a lot of experiments like this in the literature, in which he created a list of 50 or so bipolar adjectives like polite, blunt, warm, cold, intelligent, unintelligent, including all the items that Asch had used in his own impression formation experiments, and gave them to a bunch of students, they were college students, and asked them simply to pick an acquaintance, your roommate, your boyfriend, your uncle, somebody you know, and rate that individual on each of these scales. Then what Wishner did was to examine the correlations between each of the 53 trait scales and each of the remaining 52 trait scales. So he had this massive correlation matrix, 53 traits by 53 traits, which is, you can do the multiplication. It's a lot of correlations, okay? It's 53 times 52. And then simply looked at the correlations that he had. Now, you got to note when this was done. This is 1960. This is before the advent of high-speed computers in social science research. Frankly, this was before the advent of low-speed computers in social science research. When I got my first job at Harvard University in 1975, the mainframe at Harvard had less computational power than your wristwatch. It was unbelievable, okay? So what Wishner didn't have the kinds of computational power accessible to him that we would have today. He did all of this by hand and all of this by eyeball. And what he did was to examine the pattern of correlations among traits. And what he discovered was that traits that Asch had identified as central traits like intelligent versus unintelligent, warm versus cold, tended to have relatively high correlations with the other traits in the matrix. Now remember what a correlation coefficient is. A correlation coefficient is a statistic that measures the direction and strength of the association between two variables. What that means is that for traits like warm and cold, warm versus cold, or intelligent versus unintelligent, they have a relatively strong degree of association between them and other traits in the matrix. Whereas for peripheral traits, and here the example trait is dichotomy is polite versus blunt, the correlations were substantially lower. So central traits have higher correlations with other traits, peripheral traits have lower correlations with other traits, leading Wishner to conclude that what makes a trait central is that it carries more information. If a trait like warm or cold is positively correlated with lots of other traits, then if I tell you that somebody is warm or cold, you already know a whole bunch of other things about that person without me having to say it, because you can rely on the correlation between this trait and other kinds of traits to provide more information than simply that. But if I tell you that somebody's polite or blunt, the correlations between polite and blunt and other traits tend to be relatively low, so these peripheral traits provide relatively less information. Yeah? It has not been done, to my knowledge. That would be a really interesting thing to do. But this lecture is devoted to something called implicit personality theory, okay, which is a term I'm going to come to in a minute. You're ahead of me, as usual. You guys are ahead of me. This is very good. And implicit personality theory refers to people's kind of intuitive views of what personality is like. I'll expand on that in a couple of minutes. And it's entirely possible that there are not just individual differences in implicit personality theory, but it's entirely possible that there are cultural differences as well. So if you go to North America and ask people what they think about personality, they get one set of views. If you go to Japan or China or India or wherever, Bechuanaland, you would get an entirely different view of personality, because personality is embedded in people's cultural views. It's a very good hypothesis. Now, we don't know anything about that, and Asch and Wishner certainly didn't know anything about that. They're dealing with Rutgers and Penn college students, which is the culture we know best. Okay? But that's the general idea here, which is that, again, what makes a trait central is that it's related to lots of other traits. And so if you know where a person stands on a central trait, you had some sense of what he or she is like in other domains as well. Whereas peripheral traits simply don't carry those kinds that much information. Another way of putting this is that a central trait is a trait where when you change it, you change a lot of other traits as well, again, by virtue of this relatively high correlation. You got a question? Okay. Well, these are correlation coefficients. Okay. It's a statistic that measures the strength and magnitude of the association between two variables. And just to kind of unpack this for a minute, the mean correlation between warm cold and the other 52 traits in Wishner's list was 0.62, which is a very big correlation. Okay. The mean correlation between intelligent and unintelligent and the other 52 traits in Wishner's list was 0.56. Average unsigned correlation. Some of them are negative, some of them are positive. Doesn't matter. And that's a big one. Now, if you're watching this carefully, okay, the mean correlation for so-called peripheral traits was lower, but it's still a pretty good correlation. To be honest with you, in social science research, you would kill for a correlation of 0.43 between one variable and another. So, with all due respect to Wishner, this isn't completely compelling, but the pattern is interesting, and it shows us, I think, that the Wishner was onto something. In fact, Seymour Rosenberg, a personality psychologist at Rutgers University, looked at this, thought Wishner had the right idea, maybe not quite, not exactly right. Rosenberg had more computational power available to him in the late 60s and early 70s than Wishner had in the late 50s and early 60s, and he began to look at this problem over again. What Rosenberg did was to employ a variant on the correlation coefficient known as factor analysis. You don't have to know the details of factor analysis. If you want to know the details of factor analysis, there's some information on that in the lecture supplements. But basically, what factor analysis does is a technique for extracting the basic dimensions that underlie a whole matrix of intercorrelations. Okay? So what Rosenberg did was to look at a very large matrix of intercorrelations among traits, and he discovered that some of these would cluster together into higher order factors, and then some of these higher order factors would cluster together into super higher order factors, suggesting that there's actually a hierarchical structure in personality trait ratings, where at the bottom you got these primary traits like maybe warm and cold and intelligent and unintelligent, and at the next higher level you've got some other set of traits and so on. What Rosenberg in fact argued was that there are two huge super factors that run through everybody's ratings of people's personality traits, whether they're rating other people's personality traits or their own personality traits. And these two huge super factors are what Rosenberg called social good-bad and intellectual good-bad. Here's what Rosenberg's structure looks like. This is actually from an earlier study. Here you have a whole bunch of traits, and what you got here are two major dimensions: good versus bad socially, nice people versus bad people, okay? And good versus bad intellectually, smart people versus stupid people. And what you've got here is the distance between each of these traits and the vector here basically represents the association between the trait and that super factor. So that traits like unhappy, vain, finicky, irritable, and moody, which lie very close to the good-bad vector, are very highly correlated with social good versus bad. Traits like clumsy, frivolous, foolish, and naive, which lie very close to the intellectual good-bad factor, are very highly correlated with that factor. They load highly on it in the language of factor analysis. And what you can see here is that the two trait dimensions that Ash identified as central lie very close to these factors. Here's unintelligent. That's not my misspelling. That's Rosenberg's. Okay. And there's intelligent, very, very, very close to the intellectual good-bad factor. And here's cold, and here's warm, not quite so close, but still pretty good. Okay, you get the idea about what this is like. The idea here about in Rosenberg's reanalysis is not just that what makes a trait central is that it correlates highly with other traits. What makes a trait central is that by virtue of its high correlation with lots of other traits, central traits load highly on these super factors that run through trait ratings of personality. So those two big super factors are intellectual and social good-bad. Warm and cold is a central trait because it's very, very, very closely related to social good-bad. Intelligent versus unintelligent is a central trait because it lies very close in this in this scheme to the factor that defines intellectual good and bad. Now, if you look, you won't find polite and blunt on here. Rosenberg didn't actually look at that one, but the implication is that if we could locate polite and blunt in this matrix someplace, it'd be way off. Okay, it wouldn't lie close to either of these factors. That's because in Rosenberg's reanalysis, it's by virtue of loading highly on one or the other of these two big factors in personality that central traits carry more information than peripheral traits. Central traits simply have more implications for unobserved features of personality. Now, it turns out that there's a problem of, I don't want to go into this right now, it's just too complicated for the time we've got, but it turns out the context that matters to this a lot. Ash did an experiment which he just couldn't understand really at all, in which he put warm, cold, or intelligent, unintelligent into an ensemble, stimulus ensemble of lists of traits, and then ask people to show their impressions of personality on an entirely new list of traits. And it turned out that in that particular experiment, warm, cold, and intelligent, unintelligent didn't prove to be central. Now that's weird, okay, because the whole point of a central trait is that it's central to impression formation. And the reason it didn't prove central in that particular experiment was that the particular traits that Ash used to collect his impressions didn't have anything to do with friendliness versus unfriendliness or intelligence versus unintelligence. So you can find traits where where a central trait just doesn't have any implications, and then it's no longer central. Context matters, but we don't have to deal with that right now. Okay, now what's the real implication of this? If I tell you that somebody's warm as opposed to cold, and then you say to yourself, knowing that this individual is warm as opposed to cold, I now know a whole bunch of other things about this person. I have some idea about what to expect because Killstrom's given me the information about where this person lies on a central trait. The fact that you can make inferences from knowing that a person is warm or cold to a whole host of other attributes about the person means that you have to carry something like the correlation matrix around in your head. You have to carry around in your head some sense of what goes with what in the domain of personality. Because if you didn't have that, warm versus cold wouldn't be informative, okay? Because all the stimulus simply is this person is warm or cold. But in order to perceive that stimulus, in order to make sense of that stimulus, you bring to the act of perception pre-existing knowledge about the world. In this case, pre-existing knowledge about the social world. That pre-existing knowledge is what we mean when we talk about this concept of implicit personality theory, a concept that, again, was originally introduced by Bruner and Tajuri in this great 1954 paper. Yeah. Yeah, these days we might call it a schema, okay? Because a schema is an organized knowledge structure that's pertinent to some domain. You have an automobile schema, some sense if I say, let's go for a drive in my car, you have some sense of what we're going to do, okay? You have a wedding schema. If your girlfriend says, I've been invited to a wedding next Saturday, will you go with me? You have some sense of what it's going to be about. If your roommate says, you want to go out with my sister on Friday night, she's really intelligent, you have some sense of what she's going to be like, right? That's because you have these schemata, okay? Plural of schemas, plural of schema, okay? Implicit personality theory is kind of like a schema for personality. It's your pre-existing sense of what personality is like. Now, Bruner and Tajuri say, well, it's not just a schema, okay? It's really a lot bigger than that, but it's the same idea. A pre-existing organized cognitive structure that provides a framework for perception and memory. And what Bruner and Tajuri argued was that we carry around in our heads a pre-existing cognitive structure, a pre-existing cognitive representation of what personality is like, that we use as a framework for forming impressions of personality and helping us remember the things about personality. So what do we mean by implicit? Okay, it's implicit because it's, in Bruner's sense, naive. Most people are not professional personality psychologists, okay? You're not trained in experimental design, you're not trained in the methods of personality assessment. Most of you didn't even know what a correlation coefficient was before we started this lecture today. So you're not professionals, but despite the fact that we're not professionals, all of us develop in the course of everyday living some sense of what personality is like, some sense of what goes with what, some sense of what kinds of people there are out in the world. It may be right, it may be wrong, it may be accurate in some respects, it may be biased and inaccurate in other kinds of respects, but there are our own individual theories of personality that we use as a framework for social perception and social interaction. Question? It doesn't necessarily imply that, okay? It's entirely, we're going to talk about automaticity later in the course, okay? So don't hold that thought. It's entirely possible that if I say to you, you want to go with my sister Friday night, she's a very warm, intelligent kind of person, you sit there and say, okay, now before I say yes or no, let's really think hard about what that means. You know, she's warm, to kind of do this mental checklist of all the features of personality in a very conscious, deliberate way. Or it might be that somehow we're so practiced with dealing with concepts of warmth and intelligence and all that, that the whole image of what this woman is like comes to mind, okay, automatically. They were silent about this, okay? But as we'll see later on in the course, we're going to return to this concept time after time after time, because it's very, very, very important. What you'll see is that there are people who make an argument that a lot of social cognition occurs automatically, unconsciously, without much effort. I think those claims are grossly exaggerated. There's something to this automaticity argument. Anybody who's ever walked down the hall and had somebody say, hi, how are you? Say, fine, how are you? Even when you're feeling terrible and you'd rather be dead, okay? Knows that there's something to the automaticity of social behavior. But they didn't really take a position on this at all. What Bruner and Tajuri argued was that through our experience in the world, through our experience of dealing with people, learning about people, being taught about people in various kinds of ways, we build up in our heads what's essentially a naive, that is unschooled, implicit, that is not necessarily thought about explicitly, theory of personality and what people are like, that has information in it like the relations among various kinds of traits. Okay, so that's what implicit personality theory is. Lee Cronbach, who's a very important figure in personality psychology, the Bruner just kind of tossed this off in a way that he does. I mean, just an idle thought from Jerome Bruner is something that somebody else would turn into something very, very profound. The guy's brilliant. But Lee Cronbach said, well, okay, what exactly would we mean by an implicit personality theory? He said, well, let's look at formal theories of personality and use that as a model for what people carry around in their heads. So he said, first, we can think about implicit personality theory as what Cronbach called the judge's description of the generalized other, the image, the representation that we carry around in our heads about what people are like in general. That's the generalized other. Not what you're like as an individual or what you're like as an individual, what people are like in general. That's it. So first, we have in our heads some sense of what the important dimensions of personality are. Rosenberg argued that the important dimensions of personality are something like social good versus bad and intellectual good versus bad. Those are the dimensions that are important to us. Second, we carry around in our heads estimates of the mean values of the population on these dimensions. Do you think most people are smart or most people are stupid? Do you think most people are nice or bad? Warm or cold? That's what we mean by estimates of mean values. We don't mean that everybody carries around the idea that the average person scores 7.389 points on a 10-point scale of intelligence. What we mean is just kind of some sense of where the central tendency of the population is. Not just the central tendency, but also the variance in the population. Cronbach argued that we carry that around as well. So what's the spread around intelligence? Okay, there are individual differences in intelligence, but do you think that most people are smart or smart enough and only a few people are stupid? Or do you think that there's a whole lot of stupid people out there, right? That's some sense of the variance of the population. Estimates of covariances. Covariance is a technical term that for our purposes really refers to correlation, okay? So Cronbach argued that we carry around in our heads some sense of what goes with what the correlation between warmth versus cold and other things, intelligence versus unintelligence or other things. We also, Cronbach also argued, this gets back to your question, first, that there are individual differences in implicit personality theory. One person might think that most people are nice and smart. Another person might think that most people are kind of stupid, and that makes them saps, so that makes them look nice, but the important thing is that they're really stupid. Another person might think that most people are evil geniuses. Whatever it is, those individuals are going to have interesting interactions, but those interactions are going to be